Welcome back to Campfire Stories with Dick. This episode, we're going to be talking about the PeeWees again. If you haven't been watching the series, I suggest you go back and at least watch the second episode. We're talking about the PeeWees. You should watch that to get the history of the family and to find out about the very peculiar way that they talk. Otherwise, you'll be quite lost in this, I believe. So we're talking about Phillip today. Phillip, even by the PeeWee standards, was very peculiar. When Phillip would take a drag off a cigarette, he'd have it between his fingers and take a big drag off it, and then instead of flicking the ash like a normal person with his finger, he'd bang it on his knee until the ash fell off every time. That's just kind of the peculiar person we're talking about here. And Phillip, around the time that I'm going to tell this particular story, he would have been in his mid-20s or so. I would have been probably 13 or 14, I guess. But Phillip had moved to Moncton for a while. And don't know exactly why he was there. But he was there for a little while. And then he moved back home. And I don't know if anybody's ever been to Moncton before, Moncton, New Brunswick. But it's not much of a city. I'm not sure the population then now is bigger. It's only about 100,000 people. But at the time it was smaller, I'm sure. And Phillip thought this was just this great metropolis. He loved Moncton, and every time you talked to him, it would be something about Moncton. And, you know, he'd start out a conversation. Well, you know, in Moncton, they do it like that. Or he'd say, you know what? And with Phillip, if you didn't say what, he wouldn't continue talking. So he'd say, you know, he'd come up to me and he'd say, you know what, Dehi? And that was his name for me, was Dehi, because of his accent, because of his speech impediment. And so that's what I get tagged with. So he'd come up and say, you know what, Dehi? And I'd wait. I wouldn't say anything. About 30 seconds later, he'd say again, you know what, Dehi? I wouldn't say anything. About 30 seconds later, he'd say, you know what, Dehi? And this would continue until I said what. So finally, I'd say, what, Phillip? He'd say, you know, in Moncton. And he'd tell me some story about what they did in Moncton. So Phillip got in his head that he was going to build a house and he was going to move it to Moncton. So he got a bunch of oil barrels together and laid them all flat in the ground out on his lawn. And so he started building. So we get the floor all framed in. He got the majority of the, get all the exterior walls all framed up. Nothing sheeted yet, of course, just the frame. And some of the interior walls framed up. And for whatever reason, he installed a toilet in the bathroom already. Wasn't plumbed, of course, or anything. It was just sitting on the floor. Just this lone toilet and all this framed walls. So me and my friend Danny lived right across the road from them. So we used to like to sit after supper and get our lawn chairs out. So there was Danny's house and a big field where he had his garden. And right there by the side of the road is where we'd sit at the edge of this field and we'd watch the PeeWees. So at this time, there was a lot more than just the 12 kids there. There were grandkids and there was in-laws. And so me and Danny, you know, we used to sit out there, you know, when we were 12, 13 years old, and we just drink beer and watch them because they're friggin' hilarious. So at supper time, there was quite a crowd of them by then, like I said. Me and Danny counted one time, and at the peak, I think there was 27 of them all living in that house at once. So, anyhow, Phillip had this house all built up. So at supper time, you can imagine, you know, trying to feed 27 people. So they did it in stages, I guess. So the little kids ate first, and then they went outside to play, and then the adults would all eat. So the kids were all out playing by this time. Me and Danny were just sitting down, having a couple beer and watching them. And so little Lisa, she runs up into Philip's house that he's building, and so we watched her and we saw what she was doing, and we couldn't wait for Philip to come out. So Philip comes out after supper and stretches, has a smoke, throws on his nail apron and puts the hammer in his pouch. He goes over to the house. He's working away, putting up framing up some more walls, and then I could see him sniffing. He's sniffing the air. We knew what he was smelling. And so anyway, he sniffs his way over and gets to the toilet, and he flips up the lid, and Philip screams, "Why, one of you kids shit in my toilet?" So it was always entertaining to sit and watch these guys. So this next story I'm going to tell you about Philip is my favorite. It gets requested a lot whenever we're at barbecues and family gatherings. People love to hear the PeeWee stories. And this one in particular, this is also my favorite. So to get us started, I got to set the stage a little bit. So at the time, this would have been in the late 70s. And it was the middle of summer, just sweltering. We were in the middle of a heat wave. We would get those usually once a summer at least. And it would get up to, mid 90s, high 90s, sometimes even up to 100 degrees, which is very hot for here up in Canada. And back then, nobody had air conditioning. In the mid 70s, it was unheard of to have air conditioning in your house, let alone in your car. It was very rare to have a car with air conditioning because back then it was an option. It wasn't standard. So, and it was quite an expensive option actually too, to get air conditioning in your car. I remember my old man used to say, yeah, we get air conditioning in our car. It's 260 air conditioning. Roll down two windows and drive 60 miles an hour. So, back then too, in these rural areas, these little communities, most people had like a little hobby farm like we did. These days, I guess we'd be called homesteaders. But we had like 3 horses, we had a cow, we always had usually 3 pigs, a bunch of chickens, and some geese. So these 3 brothers, Morgan, Les, and Jerry, they grew up in one of these little hobby farms as well. So they had a bunch of geese. And so in the spring of the year, they decided to set aside a bunch of goose eggs and save them for Halloween, get them nice and rotten. And so during this big heat wave, one of the brothers had this bright idea to bomb the PeeWee house with them one of these hot nights. So Morgan, he was telling me the story a while ago, and he was telling me that he said those eggs were so rotten, you just pick one up and your hand would stink all day. They were that bad. So, as you can imagine, the PeeWees are all in the house. This is before all the grandkids and the in-laws and whatnot. So there was about 14 of them, probably just the 12 kids and the parents in the house at the time. So all the windows are all open because, there's no air conditioning and they're trying to catch any breeze you can. So all the windows are open, not a screen in the window. And they're all in there eating supper. So the boys, they gather up their eggs. They come down the road. They get about 2 or 3 houses away and they start running. And then they get up to the house and poof, 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 poof. They're just whipping these eggs. I don't know how many they had, but anyway, they whipped them. Some of them actually made it through the windows and bust inside the house, and some of them burst on the outside of the house and on the porch and whatever. So, as you can imagine, the 12 or 14 people in there having their supper, it's pretty noisy. You can hear everybody chatting and whatnot and going on, and all of a sudden, silence. Because they're trying to figure out what the hell just went on, right? They just were under attack. And all of a sudden, you could hear out of the silence, Philip jumps up and he goes, "Evacuate the premises, poison gas!" And there's PeeWees flying out every friggin' door in this house, trying to get away from this stench. So, I think I'm going to wrap it up with that one. Stay tuned, guys. I'm having fun doing these, and stay tuned.